Joining us now to break down the state of the 2020 race is Liz Harrington, the national spokesperson for the Republican National Committee. So Liz, I want to get your input on yesterday, what we saw, because I noticed that in a lot of the speeches, there wasn't too many policy points during the Democratic National Convention. It was a lot about talk of character or the soul of the nation. In fact, it wasn't really until Bernie Sanders later in the night where they laid out some policy proposals, which we'll get to in a little bit. But what was your overall takeaway from last night regarding the message that they were portraying to voters?
Right. And they can't really talk about policy because all of their policies would bankrupt the country with that Bernie Sanders socialist platform. I mean, he has written it with Joe Biden in their 110-page manifesto. And I think what they're trying to do is put a nice face on this radical agenda. When you talk about soul of the nation, what does it say about the soul of the nation when you want taxpayer-funded abortion up until birth? That's in the Democrats' DNC party platform. What does it say about the soul of the nation when you have members of their parties praising people, quote, rising up in the streets in Portland, where innocent people are being beaten in the street? You have people burning Bibles, trying to burn down federal courthouses with people inside. They're blinding cops. How does that restore the soul of the nation? So that was a big elephant in the room, so to speak, where you didn't have any mention of what's actually playing out when Democrats are in charge, when they do control things. They want to take over the country. They're running these Democrat cities into the ground, and people are fleeing because they want their freedom. And the law-abiding citizen, the person that just wants an equal shot at the American dream, they're suffering under this lawlessness and one-party Democrat rule.
There's this debate now that maybe people can't go to the polls. They're telling them that we may need to expand mail-in voting, and now the post office is becoming a central part of this conversation as well, although I think some of the criticisms are misplaced. We know that Louis DeJoy, the Postmaster General, is coming down to answer questions on Capitol Hill. He said today he wouldn't be making any further changes, and even the post office has its own separate funding mechanism. It doesn't go through Congress the same exact way. So when we talk about this new debate regarding the post office, what is this really about?
This is all about the Democrats. It's election season, so they need a new conspiracy theory. We lived for over 3 years with their crazy collusion theory. This is their 2020 redux. It's even more insane. It's laughably ridiculous. There aren't disappearing mailboxes. There aren't all these, MAGA hat wearing postal workers. The postal unions endorsed Joe Biden, for the record. Nothing nefarious is going on here when it comes to President Trump. What we're concerned about, and Democrats don't need to invent this. They don't need to invent conspiracies. They could look at what happened in Paterson, New Jersey, a real voter fraud conspiracy with mail-in voting. They could look at New York City, where it took 6 weeks to get any sort of results. This is all about Democrats worried about they're going to lose the election, so they need a boogeyman, and this time it'll be something nefarious going on with the Postal Service. It's a joke. Meanwhile, they're actually trying to upend our election system and nationalize ballot harvesting. All 4 people in Paterson, New Jersey, who were charged with voter fraud were charged with 1 count of unauthorized possession of another voter's ballot. In other words, ballot harvesting. That's what they legalized in California. That's what Nancy Pelosi and Democrat groups are trying to force through in the courts. That's the attack on our system. That's the attack. It has nothing to do with these ridiculous theories when, like you said, the Postal Service is independently run. They got a $10 billion loan in the CARES Act. They have enough money. They process over 400 million pieces of mail a day. It has nothing to do with Democrats' crazy conspiracy theories. It has everything to do with them trying to get an edge and have an excuse when they lose in November.
And Liz, it's also interesting that so far we're talking on day 2 of the Democratic National Convention, and we haven't even really talked about Joe Biden because he hasn't really put himself out there yet. I mean, we did see him last night do this very highly edited, almost moderator type of role where he was talking to different people. But for example, on the Sunday shows, which are typically a time where all the surrogates come out, really tout what's going to come up the next couple of days, sometimes even including the candidate himself, Silence. We didn't see anything from Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, any of the surrogates. We will eventually hear from them, but once again, it's presumably going to be in a very edited, very controlled situation, and that's what a lot of people are asking is, when does Joe Biden eventually have to come out and answer questions, face the press? Even Chris Cillizza from CNN, who is by no means a Trump supporter, is saying it's time for Joe Biden to start answering questions. Do you agree?
Absolutely. And more people in the media need to be demanding this. And President Trump takes hundreds of questions a week from a very hostile media, mind you. Joe Biden, his team of left-wing handlers are so terrified of getting questions from a left-wing press that are going to throw up some softballs. They can't put their candidate out there, because I would encourage all of your viewers, go check out on YouTube President Trump, the campaign, our new ad on Joe Biden, just in his own clips from 5 years ago, 7 years ago, 8 years ago. There's a difference there, and everyone knows it. They can't afford to have their own candidate, who they're trying to use to usher in this left-wing radical agenda. They can't even put him out there because it's too much of a risk. And so it's very plain for Americans to see. Democrats think that we're not catching on to this. We know who's at the top of the ticket. We know who's actually running things, and it's the radical left. And like Michelle Obama said, if you see something, say something. Well, we're seeing what happens when Democrats have one-party rule in these cities. We're saying something about it, and we're going to reject it on November 3rd.
And, you know, I brought up the CNN column just now, but it almost brings me to this other point about CNN as well. There was a new poll released over the weekend which shows the tightest race that we've seen so far. And I know a lot of people will kind of brush it off and say, oh, it's just another poll or it's an anomaly. But even from the same polling, using the same mechanism from the month prior, it was a 10-point swing in favor of the Trump-Pence ticket. Do you think that is an anomaly, or do you think that this speaks to perhaps a trend or kind of turning the corner for the Trump campaign going into November?
I think the Democrats have to be very concerned when the public polls show that kind of a swing, when the public polls, which are very heavily biased in favor of Democrats, they ask more Democrats, they sample more. They should be very concerned, because Americans can see, look, we're getting closer to Election Day. They see the contrast, they see the choice before us. President Trump is a leader. He is a person who came to Washington as an outsider and said, I'm going to shake things up, and I'm actually going to stop with the political games. I'm going to stop just serving for the swamp, and I'm going to get real results for Americans. We see the V-shaped recovery. We see him deliver on a day-in, day-out basis. He's traveling all over the place, meeting directly with Americans. It's a positive message. It's a can-do spirit. It's in what President Trump embodies so well. America is the greatest nation on earth. That's what we're defending on November 3rd. And they know the choice is so clear. If we want peace and prosperity, law and order, there's just no contest. We're going to vote for President Trump.
Yeah, and even going into before that poll, a lot of people were saying this is a race that's going to tighten up, at least according to the polls. I think a lot of Republicans and Trump supporters already know that it's going to be a close race, despite what the polls say. But I think we're starting to get maybe some tangible proof about this, meaning it's really going to start heating up in the media, because I noticed that that poll was not discussed very much, meaning that that's a bad sign for those who don't like the president going into November. But Liz Harrington, I appreciate you coming on, breaking down where we stand in the 2020 race. Thank you.